Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria channel. So, what I'm holding is an 8-foot long spear with a late Anglo-Saxon type leaf blade on the end. Just put it near the camera there, you can see it a bit better. It's got carbon steel hardened and tempered edges on a softer steel core. It's socketed, it's an ash shaft. The total length is around 8 foot long. The head incidentally is made by Paul Binns, who makes wonderful stuff. I'm a big fan of his work. It's all traditionally forged. Now, the subject of this video is cutting and spears. I'll try and keep this short because there's a lot that could be said about this subject, so I'll probably break it down into separate videos and film them at different points. But really this is just one point I want to make. When I have uploaded spear videos in the past, some people, not many people, that has to be fair, but some people have criticised the fact that we don't cut with the spears more. Now, can you cut with a spear? Well, clearly there are cutting types of spear. There's things known as hewing spears, as they're sometimes called from the Viking sagas. Essentially they're probably winged spears, or they might be what's sometimes known as a sword-bladed spear. In other words, it's got like this head but even a bit longer, so you've got really quite a long cutting edge on each side. But clearly you've got things like partisans and corsets and winged spears and these long bladed spears that yes you can cut with, and they become not dissimilar in fact to a glaive, which is very clearly a cut and thrust weapon. However, if we look at the Renaissance, we'll notice that cut and thrust polearms tend to be, not always, but they tend to be on shorter poles than spears. If you have a dedicated thrusting spear, then 8 or 9 foot is a good length for a spear. If you have a weapon like let's say a partisan, which you're going to use for cutting and also for crossing and uncrossing, for those of you who knows what that means in kind of George Silver terms, you actually want a shorter shaft, and they tend to be shorter pole weapons. They tend to be 8 foot maximum total length, whereas spears were very often up to 10 foot length. And the reason for that, quite simply, is the longer your lever is, the less practical it is to give chops or cuts with. Now, at some point, I've been sharpening this spearhead, and at some point I am going to do some cuts on bottles to see, and obviously I'll video it, and see how effective actually a spear of this length, kind of 8 or 9 foot, is at giving chop type cuts. However, the main point that I want to make is that if you are fighting with a spear of this length, your main concern is keeping the point online. If your opponent gets your point offline, that is the point at which they have a large advantage, especially if they don't also have a spear. But even if they do have a spear, one of the things with a spear you want to do is if you can get the opponent's point offline for a second, bam, you can hit them in the time that their point is offline safely. Sometimes you can even push their point offline and thrust in with a bind, with an opposition against their shaft. If the opponent has a sword or an axe or anything shorter than your weapon, one of their priorities is going to be to get your point offline so that they can charge you down and hit you before you're able to retract your spear and get the point back into them quickly. Okay? So the point is, pardon the pun, the point is to keep the point towards the opponent. By taking the point offline, you make yourself very vulnerable. Now, one of the problems with giving a chop type cut with a very long weapon like this is, what are you doing to give a cut? You're taking the point offline. And anybody who's quick and anybody who's a competent fighter, as soon as you raise your point, that's the moment at which they're going to charge in. Now, this is what I think is interesting anyway. We actually have some advice about this in 19th century bayonet fencing, thanks to Alfred Hutton. Now, in Alfred Hutton's time, there was a type of sword bayonet known as the yataghan bayonet that was mounted on sergeant's rifles. Sergeant's rifles were a little bit shorter than normal rifles, and therefore they compensated by giving them a longer bayonet, so they could still fight in line and have the same reach. Now, the sword bayonet, or yataghan bayonet, could be used to chop or cut, and this was dealt with in French bayonet fencing doctrine, and Alfred Hutton wrote about it in 1867. Now, what he says is that he does teach cuts with a bayonet, but what he says is you should never open with a cut. The time when you do cut is after you've actually crossed the opponent's weapon. So say for example, I'm on guard here, I'm fighting with you, we've both got spears, you thrust at my face up here, I have to bring my point up to push your point aside. So in other words, I'm parrying or guarding, I'm defending myself. Now in defending or guarding, what happens? My point comes offline because I'm defending myself, but now I can return, bam, with a straight cut. So, you can give cuts with a spear, but it's very much based on situation and context, as always, okay? And there are times when it is safe to cut, and there are times when it's very much stupid to cut. I would also caveat that with the fact that when you've got, as I've mentioned, when you've got a very long pole weapon, the cuts become slower, and there's another problem with them. I don't know whether you'll be able to see this on the camera. I'm just going to lean that spear there. Now this is an ash shaft, completely authentic, correct thickness and everything. I'm going to push down on it. I don't know if you can see. I will try and demonstrate in a different direction. Let's do it this way. There we go. Can you see that? Ash bends, okay? Any wood that you can make a safe spear out of that is not going to snap, if you make it out of very stiff wood, the chances are it will snap. Any type of wood that will make a good spear shaft is going to be flexible to a degree. And one of the problems is that the longer the weapon gets, the more wobbly it gets. And anybody who's watched English Civil War reenactment, or indeed taken part in it, will know that 16 or 18 foot long pikes droop. So if you move them around too much, they get very, very wobbly. If you're moving them in a straight line, it's not a problem. You still hit with force. But when you start trying to cut with the things, they become very whippy and wobbly and a little bit unwieldy. So it's another reason why you would want something like a partisan or a glaive to have a slightly shorter shaft and a slightly thicker shaft as well, so it's stiffer and not so wobbly. So there we go guys, some things to think about in regards to cutting with spears. I'm sure I'll say more about cutting with spears in the future. The one parting thought I'll leave you with is, of course, I'm sure that some of you who've got to this point in the video and are just about to post this, there are of course other ways of cutting, and they are push cuts and draw cuts. And they definitely are something which you could do. For example, if I thrust at someone and they knock my point aside, so the thrust doesn't go in, at that point I could return my weapon with a draw cut. Absolutely, certainly. So push cuts and draw cuts in some ways are related to thrusts. But in terms of chops, everything I've said in this video, something to think about. Cheers guys!
Click subscribe now and also follow us on Facebook.